Hello, everyone, and to the continuation of the Beyond Dispute series. And today we have a very wonderful subject, and that subject is teaching Israel. And just like in every wonderful thing, the miracle that happened to the Jewish people in the 20th century, called the State of Israel, it comes with many times with responsibilities. And, it was a dream that came true. But sometimes, when dreams come true, we don't know how to handle them. And, as we hope and wish and pray for 2,000 years, and all of a sudden, our reality is that we are in our own sovereign state. It's just incredible. I was born into it, so I don't really, have that experience, but I could gather this experience from everything around me, that there was an incredible miracle that happened to the Jewish people. So today we'll look at that too. But what I'd like to start with is to zoom into the conservative / Masorti movement in Israel that is literally at this moment reading the Declaration of Independence live at the Western Wall. That would be very interesting. I was just there when we did the Women of the Wall prayer. Let me share the screen. We can all see that. What can you see?
Nothing. Nothing yet.
Nothing yet.
Okay.
We see each other.
Okay. Let me share screen. We'll try it again.
Not yet.
Not yet. I think it's is it connecting? Hopefully. I don't know why it's not sharing it. Try one more time. Share screen. No. Wow, I'm really sorry we can't do that. This is really incredible. Let me try one last thing. Let's see if we can, because this would be a really nice addition to our class today, and serendipitously, it happened at this moment. Now, I don't know what it is. I lost the that window. All right.
Why don't we read it just in English?
Yeah, we'll just read it ourselves. I have that. But okay, I was hoping we can continue that. Okay,
Rabbi,
so let's begin.
Rabbi, it
Yes.
says host disabled participant screen sharing, meaning you've somehow disabled the participant screen sharing.
Yeah, no, that's already part of our programming. It's yeah, don't worry about that. That's not the reason. Okay, so let's just continue without zooming in. So the Declaration of Independence is a good place to start, because it is also a statement of philosophy. What is this country, this state that wished for itself for so long, but gathered from all over the world? And there's a conflict here. One, Israel was established after the Holocaust. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't have been established, because the Zionist movement already worked very hard and bought land, and there were already schools and institutions and everything else. but it definitely pushed it forward when the British mandate was about to expire that midnight, and forced the Zionist movement to just say, we're going to have to declare a state. And they were in the midst of war with the Palestinians. So let's look at the question here. There's one big question with two answers. We came here. Many Jews already lived in that land, and of course always had connection to the land. And of course we know the history of the land of Israel. No, I don't think any rational person today would contradict the notion that this is the land of the historic land of the Jewish people. But history is one thing, and reality is one. So when we somehow, the circumstances that we're not going to go through now, but the circumstances brought us to this land. And I always say, even as a rabbi, I wouldn't use the term that we use internally in Judaism to say God fulfilled his promise, because you can't take that to the UN. But you can take to the UN saying history brought us here. We were forced out, we were forced in, we are here now. But of course, there were other people that lived in this land. They weren't a nation, but they lived there. And all of a sudden, a new wave of immigrants from all over the world is coming. And of course, it threatened them. But what does the state of Israel now, in its declaration of independence, going to say? We were persecuted, we ran away, we now have a homeland, and we are going to fortify it, and we're going to be secure inside. Or we're going to say, actually, this is an opportunity for us not to isolate anymore, but to become a regular nation. Like Pinocchio says, I'm off the strings. I'm a real kid now, right? So we have a state, but actually with this particularism now of having our own state, it does also the opposite. It brings us to a place where we're like everybody else. We now have a state with borders, with a government, with a king, like all the nations. Like the generation that asked for the first king of Israel, the prophet Samuel. We want a king like all the nations. But Samuel said to them, you have a king. He's the king in heaven. And that's better for you because your society is going to stay freer that way. But we wanted a king like everybody else. And in 1948, we came back to the same dilemma. Because now we have we have sovereignty, kingship, sovereignty. For this purpose, it's the same. We now, in one instant in history, became sovereign again on this piece of land. But of course, we've inherited all its issues. So the Declaration of Independence, and I think this is the genius of the Declaration of Independence, that it leaves enough openness to be particular, and it emphasizes that idea that we're not just here to be another Britain. We want a homeland for the Jewish people. It's going to be a Jewish state, but it's going to be egalitarian. We're not going to bring some issues from the diaspora into this newly formed dream. And I always say the secular Zionism brought Judaism 2,000 years forward because it forced the egalitarianism and equality between the sexes. So certain things we left behind, or we were institutionalized that we would leave that behind. And another famous example is the Yemenite community that will be mentioned several times today. The Yemenite community and some of the Moroccan community still allowed what we would call bigamy here, but multiple wives. And in my family, my aunt was a second wife. And they came with that tradition, but in the land of Israel, they didn't want it, and they actually restricted it by law. So again, there's a clash now between tradition and between this new formed dream. And that really is the big question. And again, is what is the ratio of how much are we closed and how much are we open to the nation? And the mini kind of series on Israel here, the two-part, is exactly these two questions. Today, we will look at Israel as it wants to protect itself. And then next week, we will look at Israel as an international player. So let's begin with watching the clip. Let me get that. I hope that it will work this time. Okay, can you see this? Okay. Good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Success.
Israel drives me crazy. I use that term in both of its senses. Firstly, in the Madonna circa 1985 sense, I'm crazy for Israel. It's a place that sometimes brings me goosebumps, that makes me feel enriched and alive as a Jew, that makes me feel privileged to live in this period of Jewish history. But it also drives me crazy in the other sense of that phrase. It drives me nuts. It frustrates me with its mistakes, and sometimes it makes me want to tear my hair out or bury my head in the sand. For me, the interplay between these two sets of emotions is why I find Israel education so fascinating. In recent years, more and more American Jews have been feeling the Israel drives me nuts emotion, and that's overpowered the feelings of I'm crazy for you that were more prevalent in the past. For others, the overwhelming feeling of being crazy for Israel prevents them from engaging with or even acknowledging the aspects of Israel that drive other American Jews nuts. And for all too many American Jews, the sharp contradiction between these two sets of emotions has become too much to process, too much to deal with, and so they are checking out of the Israel conversation entirely. This tension explains why, if in the past Israel used to be the one issue that united the Jewish people, today, perhaps more than any other, it is the core issue that divides us. Engagement with Israel takes every fault line we have, left versus right, orthodox versus progressive, young versus old, and makes them even more acute. This is why teaching about Israel has become so difficult and so contentious. If a subject matter exacerbates communal tensions and fault lines, if it creates in learners contradictory emotions that are too overwhelming to process, if teaching it means that whatever you say, someone from one perspective or the other will be angry or upset, well then it makes sense to say, I think I'll teach something else instead. But if we want to impart a sense of commitment to and engagement with the state of Israel as a grand national project of the Jewish people, as an unprecedented opportunity to live out Jewish values to their fullest in the public sphere, then we don't have the luxury of simply avoiding these challenges. We need to articulate an effective strategy for Israel education. The key question in Israel education is about that strategy. How do we engender in our students, especially in young people, feelings of commitment, engagement, and inspiration in relation to Israel? And is there a place for critique of Israel in our teaching strategy? The answer to these questions is a matter of great debate. Many mainstream Jewish institutions have long argued that we should teach love of Israel before introducing the tremendous complexity of Israel, or that we should leave out the complexity altogether. This perspective posits that exposure to the very difficult realities of the Israel-Palestinian conflict and Israel's other struggles and challenges will compromise our ability to instill love. One could make a similar argument about prayer, for example. Shouldn't teaching prayer be about making sure that children know all the prayers and are saying them regularly, and only then, once we're sure they're committed, opening up questions about the existence of God and whether we actually believe all the words in the Siddur? But others will argue that nuance needs to be included and even built in from the very beginning, that committed but critical attitudes should be a hallmark of how we approach the core components of Jewish life. Because if we avoid complexity at first, at what point does it make sense to start raising more difficult questions? And how can we make that leap without it being jarring and unanchoring for our students? At what stage of someone's Jewish journey or their journey in relation to Israel do we suddenly shift our approach without creating a serious cognitive dissonance that threatens the very sense of commitment that we're trying to teach? Whether it's about Israel or prayer, isn't it a more sound approach to share both commitment and qualms, passion and critique simultaneously? And if we can tolerate and even celebrate diversity of opinion and evolving relationships with respect to prayer, can we not do the same when it comes to Israel? Let me offer an example of how these larger questions are at play, even in what might seem to be simple educational decisions. Let's take a map of Israel. You want to teach kids or adults some basic Israeli geography. What map do you show them? Does it have the green line on it? Does it differentiate between East and West Jerusalem? Does it contain Palestinian cities in the West Bank? And does it detail the complex boundaries of areas A, B, and C, which are the various different legal statuses of Jewish and Palestinian areas of the West Bank? If you start looking at different kinds of maps of Israel, you'll see several different versions, all of them giving different answers to those questions. So, which do you use? Some educators will say, let's not worry too much about the green line in areas A, B, and C. We want our learners to love Israel. And if we get them too much into the nitty-gritty of those complexities, it'll prevent them from developing that love. Other educators will say, no, that nitty-gritty is the reality of a painful and difficult situation. And I want my learners to know about it. And if that highlights aspects of Israel that are concerning, that's okay, because perhaps it will cultivate an even more robust investment in the experiment that is Israel in the long run. A simple map isn't so simple. Many people ask the question, however, is it even possible to teach commitment and complexity at the same time? And furthermore, even if you can do this with teenagers or adults, what about little kids? You can't really introduce them to complex concepts, can you? Well, good early childhood educators certainly do raise complex issues with little kids in developmentally appropriate ways. They will expose kids to issues like prejudice, equity, community, power imbalances in relationships, fairness. In doing so, they're building the groundwork for these little kids to be thoughtful teenagers in a few years' time. We can do the same with Israel education. When we teach young kids that sharing is hard and have them think with their friends about strategies for equitable use of a favorite toy or activity in kindergarten, we can add, we talk a lot about Israel, and you probably hear your parents talk about Israel, and we read about Israel in the Torah. Israel is a place where many Jewish people live along with other kinds of people. And sometimes they also find it hard to share, because it's really hard to share when you have two people who both really like the same thing and want it all for themselves. And that's it. You move on. That's complex Israel education in a developmentally appropriate and contextually appropriate way. But it doesn't just happen. Developing that kind of sensitivity to the educational possibilities of the moment requires serious thought, reflection, and planning. Because these questions aren't simple, and because there's so much potential to exacerbate fault lines, educators increasingly shy away from teaching Israel in their classrooms and summer camps. Rabbis increasingly avoid talking about Israel from the pulpit. Hillels struggle more than ever to navigate between fighting BDS on the one hand and creating space for dissenting voices about Israel on the other. Israel has become the third rail of American Jewish education and discourse. That's a devastating situation for someone like me, who believes that Israel should be part of the Jewish educational conversation, who believes that engagement with Israel has the potential to enrich diaspora Jewish identity, who believes that Israel is the greatest Jewish experiment in our history, and who wants every Jew in the world to be actively involved in that experiment. These educational and communal questions aren't simple, it's true, but they are, to my mind, amongst the most interesting, exciting, and frankly crucial for us as a people to figure out. They're questions that I've spent the last 2 decades thinking about and teaching about and writing about. In this session, I want to invite you into the conversation about these questions, because I think that this conversation is one of the most important ones that the Jewish people should be having today. So I would like you to be part of it. And in fact, I think you should be part of it. As I said earlier, my own relationship with Israel is a complex, rich one, meaningful, but not always easy. And I think that's more and more true for the relationship that many American Jews have, or want to have, with Israel. Gone are the days where people would support Israel categorically, irrespective of the actual merits or problems of whatever policy or governmental position was in question. Young people especially will no longer accept the argument that you're either with us or against us. This is why my own views align with the second of the two perspectives that I've shared with you. I believe that if we give American Jews an either-or, zero-sum choice, they'll increasingly choose to disengage from Israel altogether, to create Jewish identities devoid of Israel, to check out of this amazing Jewish experiment. So we simply must find ways to enable people to develop relationships with Israel that contain the inspiration and the aggravation, the fabulous and the frustrating, the delight and the disappointment. I recognize that this approach can create legitimate anxiety. It makes sense to wonder whether creating space for critique of Israel will weaken our feelings of connectedness and love. But I hope that this session will leave you at least considering whether critique and love are indeed such opposite states of mind when it comes to our relationship with Israel. John Dewey, the great American philosopher of education, offered a very compelling definition of education. He wrote that educative experiences are ones that open a learner to growth and further exploration. If a kid walks out of a math class and says, "Oh, I never want to see another quadratic equation in my life," then even if she's learned the quadratic formula, even if she's absolutely nailed the actual subject matter, it's not, in Dewey's view, an educative experience, because she's been closed off to further growth. What we're looking for, says Dewey, is when educational experiences leave us wanting to find out and learn more, leave us not just understanding, but desirous of further understanding. The present state of Israel education is too much like that math class. We might be teaching kids or adults about Israel, but we're too often doing so in a way that closes people off from further learning. The way we teach about Israel should prepare our learners for complexity and diversity of opinion and critique, for machloket l'shem shemaim, argument for the sake of heaven, about Israel. Truly effective Israel education will help learners experience love of Israel and critique of Israel as being interconnected, not mutually exclusive. It will allow learners to develop robust, open-eyed relationships with Israel so that they leave wanting to learn more. I hope that in this session, we'll get a glimpse of how to build that educational path.
Okay. Any first thoughts about what we've discussed before and the video about the tension, as it's called before, between the delight and deficiencies? So it's, we're 3 days before Yom Hazikaron, the Memorial Day, going into Independence Day. So I think Israel and the Jewish people really inculcated that idea that in order to live wherever they choose, and in Israel, of course, they'll have to always embrace those two sides. Sometimes it's good, and there are aspects that are good, and some aspects that are challenging. So clearly, Dr. Sinclair is more on the critical side, I would say, of Israel, but I don't doubt his love, of course, to Israel. What do you feel about that tension? Anne, would you like to start us?
Thank you so much, Rabbi Gadi. I experienced that tension enormously. And for me, I mean, he was trying to really bring to the fore the relationship between conviction and commitment and critique. And there is a close relationship between commitment and critique. You can't really love someone unless you're able to be honest with them and about them. So that's what I would have to say for starters. The other thing I would say is that his neat little early childhood example it's a neat idea, but 3, 4, and 5-year-olds don't really have a concept of what a country is. They don't necessarily know they live in the United States. They may hear about going to Israel, but it's like going to Southampton for the summer. I mean, I worked at Park Avenue Synagogue, where most of the families were well off, and some of them did go to Israel on vacations. But the young child doesn't really have, they know they're going somewhere, but they don't have the kind of concept that he was talking about as yet, of what a different country is and all that's involved there.
Yeah.
They know where they live, period.
Yeah, so conveying that.
Anyway, but it's a neat idea nonetheless, and worth thinking about. But I very much feel the commitment and critique personally, and I'm often really torn about it, because I am very critical of Israel.
Mm-hmm. And as an early childhood expert, would you say that that method of like he offered, that you can't teach the love of Israel and not teach critique? At what age would you put it then?
Well, I think you want to do both at the same time. You want to, but you're not going to give, you're not going to give very young children ideas. You're going to teach the love first to young children, as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. I can tell you that when I was growing up, it was 7. We started at in 2nd grade. We learned about the Holocaust and started learning Torah. So it's I guess they somehow figured by Jewish sources the age of wisdom is 7. So from 7, and even for minyan, if a child is very wise and educated and knows everything, you can start counting them into minyan after the age of wisdom. So and the Yemenites actually do that. They get aliyot. When we were kids, we got the 6th aliyah was reserved for children to practice.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and none of the other congregations I've ever belonged to have been do that. It's a particularly Yemenite tradition. So you'll hear about other things. So the main challenges in Israel internally, I would say, it discrimination is the headline, of course, is always the headline. The question is, who was discriminated? So at any point, I think any wave of immigrants from different countries would say, we were, on the bottom of the totem pole. Maybe, I don't know, maybe German Jews wouldn't say that, but actually they did come also after a very big trauma. So I don't know, but you would say that the biggest offense that happened inside Jewish communities in Israel was the kidnapping of the Yemenite children. Somehow there was an organization, of course it was conducted itself secretly, but Yemenite children and some Moroccan children were kidnapped, about 1,000 that they know, they have records, for adoption purposes. But they told the parents that the child died in the hospital, never showed them a body. So this was the biggest, probably would say, issue that happened between two communities. It's not altogether divorced of the Palestinian issue. And unfortunately, it is a white-brown conflict in some ways, seeing the Yemenite Jews as, Arabs at the end of the day. And so kind of being put in the same basket as, good, hard workers, but not, enough to be as equal. I was going through, Megillat Ha'atzmaut, the Declaration of Independence, and those who signed the Declaration of Independence. There's nice to see actually a representative who came as a representative of the Yemenite community. Saadia Kubashi was one of the signee of the Declaration of Independence, and he came as a representative of the Yemenite community. So it's kind of a back and forth. On the one hand, yes, we had this idea that we're going to share this, but within it there were discriminations. So that's one conflict, and the second conflict, of course, is between the Jews and the Palestinians.
Going back, was that just Yemenite or North African? You identified it by color.
Well, they definitely are considered white, Ashkenazim were considered, white. And I know that, the terms that are used in Israel, right, and in the those movements that came as a social justice movements from the Sephardic, from the non-Ashkenazi world, used the term black. And actually they used the word panterim shchorim, the black panthers. So to identify with the Black Panthers here, but definitely there were this identification of black and white. And of course, you're talking about Europe versus Africa, North Africa, or the Arabian Peninsula. So we definitely have the white and black here. Not, of course, to the degree, God forbid that happened here, but kidnapping Jewish children, the Yemenite babies, I would say it's a scar in the biography of Israel for sure. So now there's a dilemma. So are we gonna, live with it or rebel against it? And I think the Arabs have the same issues in some ways, of course, to a much greater degree. But should we cooperate with the Jews that are here after all, that the historical circumstances brought, or we rebel against it in the internal conflict or tension within Jews in Israel? Again, the black or white, or Sephardi Ashkenazi, or the I would say religious secular. That's a big one, of course. That's a huge one. What do we do with it? And in the process of negotiating our places, because there's no doubt, I don't know if anybody has a doubt that at the end of the day, we'll have to work it out, because no one is going away. So it's a matter of somehow justly divide the land and resources, and I would say the rhetoric too, the part of that dream. So do we forget that we have a gift here, though? And I think educating the next generation we'll talk about America next time more, but if we concentrate on Israel itself, what do you do in that sense? The education is where, of course, and that's why our session is about teaching Israel, not about just the conflict itself, but how to teach it. Then in those different opinions, the fight, and I see it every day, because first of all, my family is in the education system. Both my sisters are teachers and teach children, but also my nieces and nephews. But I see it on the news too. The education system is where the tug of war is. So that's where we're gonna concentrate. So the sources that we have in this booklet are okay, but we'll use them lightly. I would like to start, as we discussed, with the Declaration of Independence. I think all the ingredients are in there, and I think that would be a good gateway for our discussion. So let me share screen again. See the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Can you see something?
Yes.
What do you see?
The bottom part of the declaration, the signatures.
Good. Okay, got it.
Signatures.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, now you're at the top.
Okay.
Good. Okay, very good. So, of course, this is the translation, and I would like maybe Anne, would you like to read it for us?
Israel's Declaration of Independence. Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here, they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. Impelled by this historic and traditional attachment, Jews strove in every successive generation to reestablish themselves in their ancient homeland. In recent decades, they returned in their masses. Pioneers, mapilim, immigrants coming to Israel, Eretz Israel in defiance of restrictive legislation, and defenders. They made deserts bloomed, revived the Hebrew language, built villages and towns, and created a thriving community controlling its own economy and culture, loving peace, but knowing how to defend itself, bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants and aspiring toward independent nationhood. Why doesn't somebody else pick up from here, Judy? Can you?
Sure. In the year 56-57, which is 1897, at the summons of the spiritual father of the Jewish state, Theodore Herzl, the first Zionist Congress convened and proclaimed the right of the Jewish people to national rebirth in its own country. This right was recognized in the Balfour Declaration of the 2nd November 1917 and reaffirmed in the mandate of the League of Nations, which in particular gave international sanction to the historic connection between the Jewish people and Eretz Israel, and to the right of the Jewish people to rebuild its national home. The catastrophe which recently befell the Jewish people, the massacre of millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of solving the problem of its homelessness by reestablishing Eretz Yisrael, the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the community of nations. Survivors of the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, as well as Jews from other parts of the world, continued to migrate to Eretz Israel, undaunted by difficulties, restrictions, and dangers, and never ceased to assert their right to a life of dignity, freedom, and honest toil in their national homeland.
Okay, Sarah, you want to pick up here?
In the Second World War, the Jewish community of this country contributed its full share to the struggle of the freedom and peace-loving nations against the forces of Nazi wickedness, and by the blood of its soldiers and its war effort, gained the right to be reckoned among the peoples who founded the United Nations. On the 29th November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel. The General Assembly required the inhabitants of Eretz Israel to take such steps as were necessary on the part for the implementation of that resolution. This recognition by the United Nations as the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable. This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations, in their own sovereign state. Accordingly, we, members of the People's Council, representatives of the Jewish community of Eretz Israel and of the Zionist movement, are here assembled on the day of the termination of the British mandate over Eretz Israel, and by virtue of our natural and historic right, and on the strength of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel to be known as the State of Israel. We declare that with the effect from the moment of the termination of the mandate being tonight, the eve of the Sabbath, the 6th IR 5708, or the 15th of May, 1948, until the establishment of the elected regular authorities of the state in accordance with the Constitution, which shall be adopted by the elected Constituent Assembly, not later than the 1st October, 1948, the People's Council shall act as a provisional council of state, and its executive organ, the People's Administration, shall be the provisional government of the Jewish state to be called Israel.
And one more page. Do you want to switch here, or Susan, you want to pick up here?
The state of Israel, can you hear me?
Yes.
The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. The state of Israel is prepared to cooperate with the agencies and representatives of the United Nations in implementing the resolution of the General Assembly of the 29th November 1947, and it will take steps to bring about the economic union of the whole of Eretz Yisrael. We appeal to the United Nations to assist the Jewish people in the building of its state and to receive the state of Israel in the comity of nations. We appeal in the very midst of the onslaught launched against us now for months to the Arab inhabitants of the state of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions. We extend our hand to all neighboring states and their peoples in an offer of peace and good neighborliness, and appeal to them to establish bonds of cooperation and mutual help with the sovereign Jewish people settled in its own land. The state of Israel is prepared to do its share in a common effort for the advancement of the entire Middle East. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally around the Jews of Eretz Yisrael in the tasks of immigration and upbuilding, and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. Placing our trust in the Rock of Israel, we affix our signatures to this proclamation at this session of the Provisional Council of State on the soil of the homeland in the city of Tel Aviv on this Sabbath eve of the 5th day of Iyar, 5708, 14th May, 1948.
Amen. Okay.
Amen and amen.
First of all, clearly there are some repeating themes here. You can add to my short list. The word Jewish state appears several times, which means that's the direction, not a state of all necessarily. It's all its citizens in terms of citizenship, but it's a Jewish state, which is of course, a tension. I would say a big tension here. We were forced out. So the purpose of it is to show that we always had continuous connection to the land, and as he says that we the people, right? It's the same idea as in the United States, and would be nice maybe next session next week if you can share maybe how you think the Declaration of Independence is of Israel and America are similar. By the way, who's here reads the Declaration of Independence for the first time? The Israeli Declaration of Independence for the first time. Okay, well, that's great. Then we already did something good here. So now, what do you think is what does it give you, that Declaration of Independence, in terms when you judge it in perspective now, 74 years on Wednesday night? How do you see the failures and the successes of Israel in terms of its internal affairs, as much as you know, as much as it's transparent to you? Yes, Elaine?
All right. First, I don't know anything, but I noticed that Golda signed her name Golda Meyerson as opposed to Golda Meir. All right. Now, to try to answer your question, it's directed to just Jewish people.
That's the feeling that you get, that it's really directed only to Jewish
that
people?
no one else is there but Jewish folks.
And
That's what
the paragraph that he said that we want our the Arabs to be citizens and inhabitants of the state and preserve.
That's just candy. Yeah. That's how I see it. It doesn't include everybody.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying he's emphasizing more our historical right over the inhabitants of the land.
Jews are welcome. Yes.
He's putting them aside. Okay. Anybody else? This is.
And I'd also like to say something about education. I think Dr. Sinclair was trying to say perhaps kids should be taught about Israel when they're very young, even if they don't understand it. I mean, I take myself as an example. If I watch a film and a year has passed and I watch the same film, it's like I don't remember anything. You don't really see what you think you see. You don't hear what you think you hear, but particularly seeing, you don't see it.
Like he's talking about the
Unfortunately,
experiential aspect of education.
Right.
And yeah, so because he's talking about love and connection, that kind of
Right.
So he's saying develop the connection when
Right.
they're young, and then
Very
you can
young.
have the discussion on about the complexity later on.
Yes,
But
yes.
I agree, because that's the natural development of a child. And I would say, even if you're talking about adults that you're first educating about Israel,
Right.
don't start with getting into all this complexity
That's
right
right.
away.
Right.
And I'll give you even a Jewish reference to that. When a Jew wants to convert, it says in the Talmud, and of course in the Halacha, is that you don't overwhelm them with
Right.
all the laws now.
Right.
You're telling them in general, do you know that you're crazy enough to join a people who've been persecuted forever? That's all he or she needs to know, basically, and commit to that, and dip, and of course circumcision. But in terms of learning, you teach them basic halachot, and then they have the rest of their lives to
Right.
learn. So
Absolutely.
the connection is very important. That's a very good
Yeah.
observation.
Yeah.
Yeah, Judy?
Wasn't a fully formed thought, but he was, Dr. Sinclair didn't differentiate whether he, or maybe I missed it, whether he was speaking about education in Israel or education outside of Israel in other parts of the world. And it's interesting because I've had some personal experiences with education here in the US. My kids were very involved with Habonim, which is a labor Zionist youth movement. Very, very, very effective. And they start the kids like 7 or 8. And they go to summer camps, the Rosh of the camp is a 20-year-old. And they function on basically the principles of kibbutzim. And it's a very effective learning environment where they really build a love and commitment, and also understand the controversy and conflict within Israel. And the goal, of course, for a lot of them is to make Aliyah, which does happen. Whether they stay or not is another story.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, these experiential educational programs are amazing. Just like today.
Very effective. Not only
Yeah.
that, but they build a charuta that's lifelong. I mean, the connections that
connection. The rest is going to
Yeah.
happen on its
Yeah.
own.
Right.
the
Right.
connections are so powerful that it's exciting and interesting to see. And you don't see it. I don't see it in other places.
Right.
Mhm. Yes, the connection to step there, to say I was there, and it's real, and there's something to hold on to. Yes.
I'd also like to say that the elementary school at the Yeshiva of Flatbush gets them at 4 years of age. And you can believe me when I say they drill Israel into their brains like they drill America. And those kids grow up loving Israel, good, bad, or indifferent. And the high school, forget about it. They're bathed in it.
Yeah. So I would say in terms of, the equality that the Declaration of Independence is talking about, at least as far as Jews go, I would attest that it has been successful. think through the educations, of course, it's not perfect, but the education through the education system. And again, there's an integration that did not fully happen yet, and that's the second one between religious and secular. But I would say on the basis of background, of ethnic background, I would say, again, not perfect, but Israel has been equal and to, very much of it. And, the army adds to it, of course, that it's an equalizer, that people mingle. So I think in that sense, even with, of course, women's rights and
Right.
now with gay rights, I think Israel is doing a good job that way to make it as egalitarian and equal as possible. In terms of equality and integration between the Arab and Jews, again, that's a separate category. And between the religious and the secular is a big issue now. I would say that it exacerbated itself between the religious and the secular after the assassination of Rabin, because one side was blamed for that, the religious Zionists mainly. But I think it was already under the surface before that, because I think what pushed it also forward before 95, before the early 90s, were the very big waves of immigrations from the former Soviet Union. And they brought a lot of great things to Israel, but they did bring secularism. They did bring an aspect in Israel that, was not as much, in a sense, determined to be secular and only secular and not be defined at all by other things. So,
All right. Can
you know,
I
these
say
are the
one
main-
more thing?
yes,
Can I
please.
say one more thing? When they had the Russian wave coming to America, many of them were accepted by the high school, as well as the Syrians. The Russians had no Yiddish background, zero. But the Syrians, they could read Hebrew.
Right,
They were poor as church mice.
right. I
They were
studied with them at
accepted.
Yeshiva University. These were exactly those two
Yeah,
immigrant
yeah.
waves, and the Russians that were in the Jewish program
They,
had to
some of
learn
them
from
were,
from
yeah,
from
from
Aleph,
scratch.
Bet,
Yeah, absolutely.
Baf.
I mean,
But
for
the
me, it was,
Syrians, right, you're right.
yeah.
Yeah. So
Could
I would
be.
say, the first source that we saw in our class today, which I'd like to visit to see it, because I think it's for some reason, Dr. Sinclair chose this source to begin with, but I think I understand, because his critique of Israel is basically to say Israel is not utopia like Herzl wanted it to be. It's still, as he says, it makes me crazy, but I love Israel. This is a source that accentuates the more ethnic issue in the beginning, and we can maybe read it and talk about it. Devi, would you please? Would you want to read it out loud?
Sure. Tom Segev, One Palestine Complete, Jews and Arabs Under the British Mandate. Aaron Avraham Kabak, a teacher and author, wrote about the differences between children whose parents had come from Russia and Galicia, who were a storehouse of mental energy and intellectual talents, and children whose parents had come from Yemen. Of the latter, he said, the Yemenite child, after so many generations of idleness, penury, abjectness, and servility, under the fierce Yemenite sun brings with him, together with Oriental sharp-wittedness and willingness, a tendency for delusion, negligence, slowness of movement, with bodily lethargy and weakness of the nerves. According to Zev Jabotinsky, we Jews have nothing in common with what is called the Orient, thank God. To the extent that our uneducated masses have ancient spiritual traditions and laws that recall the Orient, they must be weaned away from them. And this is in fact what we are doing in every decent school and what life itself is doing with great success. We are going to Palestine, first for our national convenience, he wrote, and second, to sweep out thoroughly all traces of the Oriental soul.
Okay. Tough source. And, you know, when you read earlier documents, even in the United States, and people that that contributed a lot to the success of the United States, but on the other hand, saw and had slaves and saw Black people as second class at best. So this is what we see here. Yes, Susan.
This sounds more like not so much a comparison to us with Black slaves, but it sounds more to me like us with our indigenous population here, the native people.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it really feels like to me. And
right.
It's very, it's really ugly.
So, from my vantage point at this point in history, I am not insulted personally. He's talking about the Yemenite people.
Yeah.
I'm not personally insulted. I mean, I know it's unfortunate, angle, but what he is saying here, which is an interesting thing, and this is what people forget, that some Jews are indigenous to the Middle East. And so he is putting the Yemenite Jews in the same basket as the Orientals, the Arabs that live in the land already. So, and Yemenite Jews came very early to Israel. The Yemenite Jews are one of the earliest immigrants to Israel in the early 1800s and in the late 1800s. And they built all these neighborhoods as well. So when they made Aliyah, they actually moved to Israel because of messianic ideas that we are at the, if we can move to Israel, we should do it. And under the Ottoman Empire, they spoke Arabic, they knew the culture. So it was okay for them to move and dwell in the land of Israel. Okay, so yes, Susan?
He wrote this in 2000.
Right.
And it just sounds so old fashioned, it's like he's back in the late 1800s. It sounds really like Western hegemony or imperialism, it's so
right.
backwards to be
right.
to have been written in 2000.
Right. I think what Dr. Sinclair intend to do here is do two things. First is show the complexity and kind of bring Israel to earth in a sense in our eyes, and not to think that it's a perfect union, as I said, to use American terms. But on the other hand is to show that it's in its root. It was built also on this foundation of discrimination, and there are certain aspects of this discrimination that continue to linger. And I think that's really what he's trying to do here, to say we have not rid ourselves altogether from that. We're just directing it today towards the Arab population. Now, I want to point out, as a Yemenite Jew, that when you hear this, I would say racism from the Ashkenazi towards the Sephardi or the Mizrahi Orientals. Don't think that it doesn't exist on the other side too.
Yeah.
That Sephardi Jews or more brown Jews do see themselves as more authentic Jews that did not, had intermarriages or somehow were too close to the host environment. So, it exists on both sides, but
yes, but they have not had the power he chose Jabotinsky to speak for him here, who was somebody that many very religious people and far right people believed in strongly.
and
Right.
still do.
And looking at that list, there is, as you pointed out, there is one Yemenite, but
There's only
every
one.
other person on that
Every-
list is of German or Eastern European origin, every single one of them.
And right. Yeah. So of course the chauvinism existed on many levels, chauvinism, of course, in terms of look at the number of women, signed there. So it's it really is in a sense the same. And I would say the most important thing to teach about Israel, that we are in the process, that it started just like in America from one point, but it's determined to arrive at a different point, to have a conversation, to have a discussion, and the progress that it made in the years. Again, it doesn't go without struggle, of course, and pushing and civil rights movement, of course, but we are at a different place at this point. And what it does, I think, for me at least, and I know other people, that at least what it does is gives hope that where we are today backwards in some ways, if you want to say maybe in the conversation between religious and secular, or between Jews and Arabs, there's hope because we're always in a conversation and evolution. And frankly, as I always say with my trips, the pilgrimages that we do on Project Genesis, every year I'm more and more convinced that it's not even, that conversation is mandatory. It's not even optional. We're not doing anybody a favor. It's automatic. It's going to happen. We don't have a choice, but trying to figure out how we all fit in this jigsaw puzzle. Okay, and of the rest of the sources, because you did say that this kind of some of them irked you.
And that's one that's very extreme, but I haven't looked at them for a week now, and my memory is worse than Elaine's, much worse. And so I didn't feel the next one was, the next one seemed okay. It was the Rabbi Hecht that I thought was the really.
Yeah, so we'll go there, but yes, this one we'll save for next week, because this is how students are taught here. So we'll go to source. This one. Okay. Okay, we need a volunteer reader here. Elaine, would you like to read that source?
That's page 3. Okay.
Source
Excerpt.
3. Mhm.
Yeah. Excerpts of interview with M.K. Bezalel.
Member of Knesset. She's the member of parliament, the Israeli parliament.
The face of Israel's far right wants to abort Palestinian hope. Rabbi Hecht is a journalist for Haaretz, born in 1980. Bezalel Smotrich is a member of the Knesset for the Jewish Home Takuma Alliance, born in 1980. Not
Okay, so
too-
let me just give a little background here. So Haaretz is a very left-wing newspaper. I don't necessarily doubt its reporting abilities, but they definitely are identified with the left wing camp. She's interviewing Bezalel Smotrich, who is very right wing. He's all the way to the right, basically saying, the rights to the whole land, from the river to the ocean, he would say even beyond the river, the east bank of the Jordan River, of course, what we say, Eretz Yisrael Hashlema, the complete Jewish state. But this is what he is thinking. So the first source we read was kind of shedding light on the Ashkenazi Sephardi kind of tension, and this is now, of course, between the Jews and the Arabs and the Muslims, or I would say Arabs in general because they're Christians. But let's not forget, he is talking from a perspective of a very right wing and very religious. So he is what we call Zionist, a religious Zionist. There's a secular Zionist and a religious Zionist. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
What is your political diplomatic plan? And he answers, we are placing a different alternative on the table, a plan that is not based on the country's partition, but on its unification. I want to apply Israeli sovereignty in all of Judea and Samaria. Okay. And thus create a Muslim state between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River.
That's a
No,
question. That's another,
Yes, that's
that's
a
her
question.
second question.
no, I build another 5 cities, bring in another 500,000 or 1 million Jews. But first of all, I make a decision. The gist of my plan is based on making a determination. After 100 years of conflict management, we make a decisive move vis-a-vis the conflict. I abort the Palestinians' hopes of establishing a state. He's right out in your face. He's not hiding anything. He's right out there. Okay. And she says, how do you do that? Joshua,
How do you do that? She's asking him, how do
Yeah.
you avoid under your plan to prevent Israel from becoming Muslim majority?
right. But she's polite. She doesn't really say everything. When Joshua ben Nun, the biblical prophet, entered the land, he sent 3 messages to its inhabitants. Those who want to accept our rule will accept. Those who want to leave will leave. Those who want to fight will fight. The basis of his strategy was, we're here, we have come, this is ours. Now 3 doors will be open. There is no 4th door. Those who want to leave, and there will be those who leave, I'll help them. Oh God. When they have no hope and no vision, they will go, as they did in 1948. He's so blatant, no manners. So
Do we know when this interview was?
2016, December 3rd, 2016.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
6 years ago.
yeah.
It's not even 6 years, Susan.
Right. So he was in the coalition back then. Today, he's not in the coalition. They parted with Naftali
God.
Bennett before. So we saw just 2 examples when we, talk about Israel and teach about Israel. Just 2 such incredibly complex internal issues. And we have not, even looked at others like poverty. Again, this is the wealthy versus poor, and all that, the city people versus the more of a kind of the far towns, what we call the periphery. But these are complex issues that exist maybe everywhere, but there are unique issues that are complex for Israel. And I think these two sources really show us these two examples. So what do you feel about this kind of rhetoric, or in a sense, that issue? How do you teach this? How do you convey this to kids, that live in Israel? But don't forget, when you talk about Israel, they have, even though they're not in the coalition today, but there are many people who support them. They have a few mandates, a few seats in the Knesset. So we're talking about many, thousands of people who follow them, that believe that Israel is, belongs to the Jewish people solely. So yeah, what is your feeling about that, and how do you teach that exists in Israel? Yeah, Susan.
Well, it exists here
In terms of what?
in terms of people that want this country to be one way and people that want it to be another way. What is the difference between how you teach that?
Okay, so what you're saying is that even though this is a unique, complex issue for Israel, but in some ways it's not unique to the fact that there are complex issues everywhere that people fight over.
When you
So
have a
when you-
when you have a government and you have, when Israel became a nation like the rest of the nations, and you have a government and you
Exactly.
have people, this is what you've got.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
They're living these two paragraphs now. The only hope humanity has is to talk. You have to sit down with people you hate, people that are disgusting, but you have to talk and try to make things better. And believe me, if you talk long enough, they get better. You don't think they ever will, but they do.
so why don't you say that to when rabbis talk, that they need to talk longer?
Yeah,
Keep
Yeah.
talking.
yeah.
Yeah, but that's because rabbis are paid by the minute, like lawyers. They're
Right.
like lawyers. We're all paid by the minute.
No,
Ah,
you
that
gotta
would
talk
be
it out.
nice. Yes. Okay, so I think we have time to look
Well,
at.
I
one more
think
thing.
we didn't go to the end of this source where she asks, why do you say they are a lie? She's talking about his brother is a Reform Jew, and although he loves his brother, he can't accept him. The big difference between Orthodox Judaism and Reform Jews is that I believe in the existence of absolute truths. That is my life.
Right.
That's, if you were going
let's
to have a
let's-
conversation,
let's-
and I think it's very, very hard to have a conversation with someone like this. You start where his heart is in some sense. I'm not sympathetic at all, but if you're going to start talking to him, you have to start where his heart is. And that is his utter belief in a very traditional Judaism.
Yeah, so instead of actually going to another source, let's just finish then this conversation. So Elaine, you want to continue reading that?
Oh, yes. Where was I?
It's I'm sharing this on top of page 4.
Yes, right. And those who do not go and do not accept you as the sovereign power, in my view, that's most of the Palestinians. And then he says, those who do not go will either accept the rule of the Jewish state in which they can remain, and as for those who don't, We will fight them and defeat them. And then she says, you have 2.5 million people in the West Bank, not the PA or Abu Mazen,
PA is the Palestinian Authority.
or Abu Mazen,
Mazen, who is the head of the Palestinian Authority.
but people who can rise up against you in a popular intifada, children who throw stones. That won't happen. It won't happen. If we show an iron hand, there won't be children who throw stones. The guy's dreaming. Anyone who throws stones will not be here. I mean, no, no. All
Okay.
right. And
Might
then
as
she
well-
says,
Yeah.
why? What will you do with him? What will I do? Either I will shoot him, or I will jail him, or I will expel him. I don't know why they put this stuff in bold.
Yeah, so, okay, so Susan has a comment here.
Well,
Su-
this sounds like Putin right now.
Yeah,
I will shoot him or I will jail him. And, you know, there's no, well, there are people leaving Russia like crazy, but that's what that sounds like. It sounds like that total authoritarian rule.
All right, yeah, well, you know what? Why don't you continue reading, finish it up then, Susan.
Let's talk a little about Jews you love somewhat less, Reform Jews, LGBTs. It's not a matter of love, but of legitimization. Look, I have a secular brother. I love him and he is my best friend, but I don't accept him. I tell him, my brother, you are wrong. You are living a life of lies. I was asked the same thing about the Reform Jews. On the one hand, I feel that the state should take responsibility for them. I love all Jews, really. All Jews are my brothers, but I do not accept them and I will not accord them legitimacy because in my eyes, they are a lie. Why do you say they are a lie? Do you like it when people say you are crazy or messianic? The big difference between Orthodox Judaism and Reform Jews is that I believe in the existence of absolute truths. That is my life. The Lord is one, not 30. He created the world and he gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai. That is the meaning of Torah from on high. Torah from on high is above me and I am bound to it. I cannot legitimize the distortion of the truth in the Jewish state, just as I cannot legitimize Christianity.
Ooh. So he touches upon a few of those points that we have talked before about secular Jews and religious. So he kind of hits a few points here. Clearly, a mindset of, as we started, and it's a good place to kind of wrap this up. The issues that we've laid out in the beginning was the decision that the new Jewish state had to make in the ratio of how much does it want to still be inside the walls and how much does it want to open to the other nations. So these are two examples, at least the last one, about really staying within the walls. And next week we were going to look at what it means for Israel to look outside the walls and develop its relationship with its diaspora. And even if they don't see eye to eye, it's the same idea, that dispute, the complexity. But these are the two options, and every Independence Day, Israeli Independence Day, like this week, these issues are brought. But I would then conclude by saying, but it does not detract, and it shouldn't be, and they're not, they're could be mutually exclusive, in a sense that you can love Israel and what it stands for, and even the opportunity of having this conversation is a blessing.
Rabbi, this Bezalel Smotrich speaks as though he's a member of a sect. He's so positive that he's right and everybody else is wrong. That's what he sounds like. He's ultra too much, too much.
Very convicted. He has
Yeah.
very strong conviction. And,
No room for a maybe.
very convinced.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's great that you broke this into 2 sessions. I didn't really, you know, made sense to me, but I see the power of what you're offering this way. I think it was a good idea. Yeah, lots more to talk
Thank you.
about next week.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
And a lot of you came back, which we're very happy to see. And we understand, you know, everybody has all kinds of stuff they have to do that isn't only getting together at 11:30 on a Sunday morning. So
Especially
thank you.
if it's beautiful out.
Yeah.
But you know, in the greater world, many people, possibly the majority, believe that Judaism is a religion, and just like like Buddhist or any other religion, it's not a people. But I think Jews think of themselves as a people and a nation, in addition to being a religion. So I think that causes a lot of confusion, particularly when you have a Jewish state. There's no such thing as a Protestant state, although many nations are Protestant. There's many nations that are majority Catholic, but there's only one Jewish state, and a lot of people ask, well, why do you need a Jewish state? You're a religion. You're a people. Why do you need an actual country? I mean, I think Jews understand it because of the sufferings and being a pervasive minority in the entire world. It diminishes our power. So we have been lucky to basically be given the land of Israel. I mean, we always believed that the land of Israel was ours, but believing that and and having the rest of the world agree with you and say, yeah, you should have a country. You know, that's your country. That's okay with us.
Yeah, I have to say that, you know, in Jewish Muslim relations and interfaith conversation, it's always an issue. It's always an issue. And that question of, oh, why do you insist on having a land? You know, it kind of, it puts the conversation kind of at a dead end. And you know, so it's, you know, of course we need the land. And so I would say that, you know, in many ways, the complexity was increased by having a land, but I think it was more complicated for the Jewish people before it had land. And
Nevertheless, yeah, it's when we get to the last session, it's very clear why we need a land.
Right. You know, my parents lived in a Muslim land, and they were second-class citizens and on all levels. So, you know, they weren't killed every day, and they had good relationship with their neighbors, immediate neighbors, but you know, the atmosphere was always that you're just walking on eggshells. And that's really the point of Israel, is to be a place where Jews don't have to walk on eggshells.
I mean, I have to say that when I was in Israel, I actually felt a release of tension. I was born and raised in America, so you know, America has been very good to the Jews, you didn't feel persecuted, but even so, being in Israel, it never even occurred to me. I was like, you know, like I tell the front seats, I was a dog off a leash, you know.
Wow.
I
Wow. What an expression. What an
I know it sounds horrible, but
no,
basically,
it actually sounds amazing. And especially when, you know, people have dogs. I understand that. I mean, but that's really amazing. I've never heard that kind of an expression.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Articulated that way, that sense of freedom, that way that you're among your people, you can walk free. So I want to just stop the recording and we can continue after that if you'd like. But thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. And we'll continue next week with the complexity of Israel's relationship with its diaspora. And I think it was important today to look into Israel's internal complexity, because it'll help us to understand some of the miscommunication with the diaspora, that we're the mindset is in a different place. So thank you very much, and let me
Thank you.
Thank you.
stop the recording, which is stop.